Hello, my name is Paul Fisher. I'm an Associate Fellow at Said Business School at the University of Oxford, and I'm the Programme Director of the Oxford Programme on Negotiation, where people from around the world come to Oxford to learn the art and science of negotiation. One of the questions I often ask participants on our programmes is how often they negotiate. And the answer is all the time. Now, of course, when we think of negotiations, we often think about the large-scale negotiations, the ones you read about in the news, mergers and acquisitions, treaties, trade agreements, peace talks, and of course, the most important negotiation going on in the world today, the climate change negotiations. But then there are other activities we are more familiar with. So, for example, buying and selling a house or car, a boat, at work, securing a higher salary, negotiating your working conditions, through to securing budgets, resources, or more ambitious change transformation projects. And if you've got young children, you're often negotiating with them all the time as well, although it's not always negotiation, maybe a little bit of coercion as well. But essentially, negotiation is a back and forth communication designed to reach an agreement where you and your counterpart have some interests that are shared and others that are opposed. And I like to think of negotiation as addressing this fundamental question: how might we engage with others in a way that yields better outcomes and better understanding? Yet, despite negotiation's prominence in our lives, too many people see negotiation as a competitive sport where there are winners and losers. And what I would argue is that it doesn't have to be like this. Negotiation can be a collaborative exercise where you can create value for both sides. You are essentially working together to solve a problem. Now, this doesn't mean there's not a competitive element. On the contrary, but it does mean that both sides can be better off than they were previously. I want to talk about two key areas which are the core of all negotiations: claiming value and creating value. The common perspective on negotiations is that they're all about claiming value. Now, I'm going to show that there's much more to negotiation than that, but it's still important to understand that there's always an element of claiming value. Some people, for example, might use the power approach in negotiations, coercive power moves, threats, bullying, in order to try to get their own way. And this dimension is used in the full spectrum of negotiations, from very small negotiations right through to substantial international trade negotiations. Many commercial negotiations between parties of different sizes, for example, will have this power dimension where people are using their superior powers to drive down their own costs or drive their own profits up at the expense of their counterpart. Have you ever made concessions as a result of these power tactics? Well, the answer could well be yes, because we find these tactics disconcerting. We get intimidated because we don't like conflict. What I would encourage you to do in such cases is not only try and advance your power, but also to display sufficient confidence, what I would call resolve, to counter such tactics. And there are other important means of addressing these power tactics which can claim value for yourself in a negotiation. And I'm going to focus on three main areas: anchoring, alternatives, and information. Firstly, anchoring. Anchoring means that you depend heavily on an initial piece of information when making decisions. A random number can have a dramatic impact on your judgment. Anchoring was first explored by two economists, Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, where students were shown a Wheel of Fortune game, and the numbers were rigged to show 10 and 65. Then the students were then asked to estimate the percentage of African nations in the United Nations, and the average estimates came to 25 and 45 based on whether they were shown the random numbers, the completely random numbers, 10 or 65. So the fact that people adjust rather than create when making decisions enables the making of the first offer to be really powerful in negotiations. It can anchor discussions around your proposal and help you ensure that you are more likely to claim value. Now, the caveat to this, of course, is that you should only anchor if you have enough information, and more on this in a minute. The second technique for claiming value in negotiations is generating what I call in negotiation terminology your BATNA, your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. If you have good options elsewhere, then this will put you in a better position in a negotiation. Take procurement, for example, where you're negotiating with a new supplier. If you have multiple options elsewhere, you're going to be in a stronger position to negotiate. The same with a salary negotiation, where you have rival offers. So I would advise you to work on your alternatives away from the table and make sure that you don't get so caught up in the negotiation and getting a deal that you actually forget those alternatives. You should only get a deal in a negotiation where the value of saying yes exceeds the value of saying no. Then finally, when it comes to claiming value, there is information. Now, information is a huge source of power in negotiations. The more information you have on your counterpart, the more you will understand where they're coming from, what they're trying to achieve, the more successful you're going to be in a negotiation. But of course, negotiations are based on imperfect information, where sometimes one party has more information and a greater understanding than the other. So if you can understand that, and if you can correct that balance, whether it be through listening, questioning, research, then you will also greatly enhance your power and your position in the negotiation. So how can this be achieved? Well, the most important thing is to focus on interests rather than positions. In many negotiations, people just focus on their positions, their goal. This is my red line. This is non-negotiable. I refuse to move on this point. But interests, on the other hand, are the concerns, the needs, the wants, the motivations that make up that position. And often you might have incompatible positions, but compatible interests. So in a negotiation, it's much more helpful not to ask what someone wants, but why they want it. And if we can understand these interests, and if we can expand the issues that we're negotiating over, then we have the possibility of what we call smart trades, where we can give away something that doesn't cost us much to give away, but in return get something back of much higher value, and vice versa with your counterpart. So in negotiation, it's not similarity that matters, it's actually differences. The more different we are in terms of what we want, oddly enough, the greater the potential for gains and for creating value in a negotiation. What are those differences? They could be interests, options, risks, forecasts for the future. Wherever you've got those differences, then you've got the possibility of a really interesting negotiation. And as I mentioned, in order to create those joint gains, we need to expand the issues. Anytime you have multiple issues that you can negotiate over, there is that opportunity to trade. It's very often the single binary negotiations over price, for example, where the negotiation comes to a standstill. Of course, in a negotiation, you don't know how the other side values different items. So you're going to have to enter the negotiation prepared to learn and to communicate and share interests. Negotiation is essentially the art of the inquiry. We need to listen really, really carefully, and we need to ask powerful questions that unearths information. Now, when it comes to sharing information, there's also a very natural concern of making yourself vulnerable by revealing too much information. This idea that I don't want to be made a fool of. I don't want to give too much information where my counterpart will exploit me. So the answer to this is that you don't talk about what your absolute preferences are, what is by far the most important issue to you, but what your relative preferences are. I would prefer a bit more of this than that. If I had a choice of X or Y, I'd probably go for X. In this way, you signal the path of direction in the negotiation without giving away too much. So in summary, as I mentioned, negotiation always has a competitive element. The dynamics and the challenge in any negotiation, however, is to try and improve outcomes. And creating value is essential to that in order to be then able to actually capture a good share of the value for yourself and create a win-win outcome for both sides. So of course, what I've told you in the last 10 minutes is just a small element of negotiation. And in terms of what we cover, we spend a whole week looking at the art and science of negotiation. And I think there's three sort of key areas where our program really differentiates itself from others. Firstly, the quality of what we cover and the faculty. We have a very diverse faculty covering a lot of different issues relating to culture, relating to preparation, relating to multi-issue, multi-party negotiations. We have faculty from the world of diplomacy, Baroness Ashton, who used to run the European Union's foreign policy. We have one of the world's leading hostage negotiators. So we look at all those different perspectives and dynamics around negotiation. A second element of the program is we have tutors. Now, these tutors ensure that what you learn in the classroom can align itself with your day-to-day challenges. We want you to be able to go away from this program and actually ensure that it instigates real behavioural change. And the tutors offer this ability for you to reflect back on what you've learned and figure out how you can apply it to your day-to-day negotiation challenges. And the third element, I think, is the cohort. You will learn a lot from us, but you will also learn a huge amount from our cohort. And as I said, we have an incredibly diverse cohort. Our last program, we had 24 different nationalities. So for every negotiation simulation you're doing, every interaction, you're essentially doing a cross-cultural negotiation.